Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 101, Granny Morgan. Granny Morgan was born Anne Collins, the daughter of Edward John Collins, a convict, and Elizabeth Adams, a free settler. Anne Collins was born at sea, just off the Heads at Sydney, on board the Admiral. Her father, Edward John Collins, was born in 1774 in England, and he married Elizabeth Adams prior to his transportation, however the date is unknown. And his court record states that Edward Collins was indicted for feloniously stealing on the 5th of August 1789 a gelding, the property of John Meagher. Benjamin Smith sworn, "The prisoner brought me a bay gelding on the 5th of August into Sharp's Alley, Cowcross, and he asked me for a guinea for it. And he said he brought it from Croydon and that the wagon was to come to the Bear and Ragged Staff in Smithfield. I told him to fetch me the wagoner, and I should be more than satisfied that it was his property. He wanted to take the horse with him, but I stopped the horse. I afterwards inquired whether any such wagon was coming from Croydon, and I was informed no. I advertised the horse twice and kept it very nigh a week. I never saw the prisoner before. When he went to fetch the wagoner, he did not return, and I know more of this horse. I inquired at the blacksmiths at Streatham, found out that the prosecutor, Mr. Meagher of Norwood Common. The prosecutor came to my house and saw the horse and swore to it. I am sure the prisoner is the man that brought me the horse." John Meagher sworn, "I live in Croydon Parish, the site of Norwood Common. I missed a horse on the 5th of August in the morning. I saw him overnight in my own field towards evening. At 5 or 6 o'clock the next morning, the man informed me that the horse was gone. Say I am sure he was stole, for the gate was thrown open and not shut again. It was a bay gelding. I did not hear of it until Saturday, when the last witness came to tell me where he was. He sent for me to the Rose and Crown, and I saw my horse at Clerkenwell on the Monday following, in the street at Justice Blackborrow's. I am sure it is my horse. I have no doubt about it. I know the prisoner. I have seen him several times about our neighbourhood. I have had no great acquaintance with him. He is a labouring man." John Dinmore sworn, "On Saturday the 9th, I was sent for by Minshall to take the prisoner into custody on suspicion of stealing another horse, about 9:15 in the morning. Hearing there was a horse stopped by Smith, I had him sent for. He came and owned it was the prisoner. When he had confessed where the last horse came from, says I, 'Take the horse with you. By the description of it, maybe you will hear from whom the first horse came.' There was not a promise or threatening in any respect whatsoever. He was a long time before he confessed the first horse, but he said he took it from near the same place, and the man's name was Meagher." The court to Smith, "Was it in consequence of that information that you inquired for Mr. Meagher?" He said, "Yes, my lord, it was in consequence of what I heard the prisoner say." The prisoner said, "I leave it to the mercy of the court." The jury to the prosecutor, "Was the gate shut the evening before?" "The gate was shut the evening before and pinned with a stick. I fastened it myself." The jury asked, "Could the horse get out any other way?" And he said, "I saw no gap he might get over." So as a result, Edward Collins was found guilty and given the death penalty. On the 9th of September 1789, his sentence was commuted to transportation for a term of 7 years. He sailed on the Albemarle from Portsmouth on the 27th of March 1791 as part of the Third Fleet. Early in the voyage, several convicts tried to take over the ship. 2 convicts were shot, Sydney and Lyons, and 2 seamen were also implicated, and they were put in irons and landed at Madeira and sent back to England. Elizabeth Adams, Edward Collins's wife, sailed to Sydney on the Admiral Barrington and arrived on the 8th of October 1791, the day their daughter Anne was born, coming into the Heads. Anne's birth certificate stated that her name was Anne Colling. She was baptised on the 27th of November 1791 in Sydney, and her father was Edward Colling and mother Elizabeth. Elizabeth Adams died one day after giving birth to a son, Edward, on the 6th of January 1795, and Edward died 2 months later. Edward Collins then married Sarah Hines at St Philip, Sydney on the 20th of April 1800. They already had a daughter, Sarah, that was born in 1799, and another child, John, was born in 1801. In 1800, Governor Hunter proposed that two groups of men form to create the Loyal Sydney Association. Among their duties was being sentry for Governor Gidley King at Government House. The association ceased in 1809, and Edward Collins was part of this group. In 1807, his daughter Anne married a convict brickmaker, George Morgan, on the 3rd of September 1807, when she was only 15. George Morgan was 28. However, there is no marriage certificate that validates this marriage. George Morgan had been born in 1779 in Middlesex, England, and he was indicted on the 10th of December 1797 at the age of 18 for being in the dwelling house of George Brooks and feloniously stole 203 copper halfpence, 5 china bowls valued at 30 shillings, a tea caddy valued at 5 shillings, a pound of green tea valued at 8 shillings, 4 glass rummers valued at 2 shillings, and a wooden drawer called a till valued at 6 pence. George Brooks sworn on Saturday the 10th of December in the evening between 9 and 10, the prisoner was drinking with 3 or 4 persons in my house. I keep the Plough at Tottenham. I have known these men for 3 or 4 years. I opened the door at about 11 o'clock and let them out. By some means or another, the candle went out. Those persons went out, but I don't recollect Morgan going out with them. I did not see him go. I then came back and lit my candle at the fire in the bar, and there were 8 shillings and 11.5 pence in the till. There might have been more. I had examined it on the Thursday before. This was on the Saturday when I locked up, and to the best of my knowledge, there might have been 11 or 12 shillings, all copper, except a bad shilling. I then went to bed as usual, directly after they were gone. The family were all gone to bed but myself. The maidservant found the back door wide open the next morning. I came down and found the door that goes into the garden open, and that the till was forced open with some irons that had been taken from the fire. Then I looked about the house of Mr. Tea Caddy with a pound of 8 shilling green tea that had been put in the same morning. After that I went into the back room and looked into the buffet and found 5 china bowls gone. They had left the matches burning underneath in the bottom of the cupboard. I went into the front room and missed some glass tumblers. I cannot tell how many. I suppose there were 5 or 6 gone off the sideboard. I then immediately went into the garden to see if I could find the till, supposing it might have been thrown away. I did not find the till, but I found the lock of it, which I have in my pocket. How do you know it to be the lock of the till? I locked it up myself every night. One of the witnesses went down to a field adjoining the garden and found 5 china bowls, 4 rummers, and then I received a note from Mr. Patrick that there was a suspicious man in his house selling good halfpence, 14 pence for a shilling. I got a warrant and went to Mr. Patrick's and had him apprehended. Mr. Patrick keeps the White Hart public house in the same parish. The prisoner asked the officer's name. His name is Tatham, and said he wished to speak with him in another room. He then went into the room with him and he put his hand in his pocket and said, "I am the person that robbed you. This is your property." He produced 8 shillings and 11.5 pence in copper and a bad shilling and 6 pence. In going to the magistrates, I asked him what he had done with the till and the tea caddy, and he said he concealed it in a ditch at the back of Mr. Scales's sand house. Some persons then went and found it there. I then asked him if he had any confederates, and he said that he had one that he let in at 11:30, whose name and person he knew very well, but would not swear to him. Did he describe how he let him in or where? And he said yes, at the back door in the garden. When had you seen this back door last? He said, I saw it bolted at 11 o'clock when I went up to bed. There were 2 strong bolts and no lock to the door. Are you sure that these bolts were shut? And he said, yes, I bolted them myself. Francis Patrick was sworn. I keep the White Hart. The prisoner came to my house between 11 and 12 o'clock on Sunday in the forenoon and asked for a pint of beer, which was brought him. A little while after, somebody came in and said Mr. Brooks's house was robbed, and his reply was, well, he can well afford it and I wish I was the person. A little after, some people came in and he was telling them he had worked 4 days and his master had paid him all halfpence but 1 shilling, and if they would take any halfpence of him, he would let them have 14 pennyworth of good halfpence for a shilling, and there were some people in the house that brought some of them, one 14 pence for a shilling and one 7 pence for a sixpence. My wife said, a man that works hard for 14 pence would not sell it for 1 shilling, and he said, you seem to be sharp upon me. I sent a note to Mr. Brooks, and he came with the constable and took him. John Tatham sworn, I apprehended the prisoner on the 11th of December at Mr. Patrick's. I went along with Mr. Brooks. He said he was the lad that did it, and here is your property. And as we were taking him to the magistrates, I told him, if there is anybody concerned with you, you had better tell. And then he said there was one Jack Brooks concerned with him, and he said he had hid the till behind Mr. Scales's sandhouse. He produced it, and the halfpence was found upon him. David Wolfe sworn, I am a bricklayer and horse patrol. I found the caddy and till on Sunday morning about 7:30. I asked the prosecutor if he knew who was in his house last the night before, and he mentioned this man. I came at the time he was apprehended, and I asked him if he had any confederates. He said no at first, and then afterwards confessed. This Brooks coming along the fields, and as we were going to the justice, he told me the till and caddy were hidden in a ditch behind Mr. Scales's sandhouse, and I went there and found them according to his description. I brought them back again to Mr. Brooks's house, and then we went to the magistrates, but he was not there, and the prisoner was taken to the cage. The prisoner's defence, when I was taken, I was in liquor, and I owned to it. So he was found not guilty of the burglary, but he was guilty of stealing to the value of 39 shillings, and as a result he was transported for 7 years, and he was tried by the Middlesex jury by Lord Chief Baron. Due to the troubles in the Channel in France, ships for transporting convicts to the colony were in short supply. So after his trial, George was delivered to the hulks at Portsmouth on the 27th of March 1797, and nearly 5 of the 7 years had passed by the time George had reached Botany Bay on the 14th of December 1801 on the ship the Canada. So as a result, George was free by servitude by January 1804. Anne's father, Edward Collins, died in Sydney in 1810. He was aged only 40. Anne and George Morgan had 15 children, all but one living into adulthood. In 1815, George Morgan supplied 60,000 bricks for the building of the Rooty Hill Watch House. By 1821, they were living at Minto. In the 1825 muster, George was listed as being employed by Captain Campbell. In 1826, Morgan's place of residence was at Minto at Retreat Farm, which is now called Bringelly. And by 1828, the Morgans were living at Stoke Farm, one of Reverend Hassel's properties, and he was a brickmaker for Hassel. George died at a property called Denby, owned by Thomas Hassel near Cobbitty, New South Wales, on the 3rd of September 1846, at the age of 69, when his youngest child was 9. Thomas Hassel performed the burial at St Paul's Church at Cobbitty. Anne stayed at Denby, Cobbitty, until approximately 1852, when she moved to Kelso to live with her eldest son, William. After William died in 1881, Anne moved to Sydney to live with William's wife, Janet, and her grandsons, William and George. And an article says, it's a matter of some interest to know who is the oldest resident of Australia. The honour is claimed to Mrs. Anne Morgan, who resides in Pitt Street, Redfern. She came to the country in 1781, having been born on the passage out. Her father was in the New South Wales Corps, commanded by Colonel Patterson. She's 94. She is hale, possessed of all of her faculties, and is a great-great-grandmother. It is probable that there are many persons on this continent older in the matter of age who arrived here much later on, but as none of those who came in the first fleet in 1788 are living, Mrs. Morgan must be our oldest inhabitant. Her memory enables her to recall what Sydney was in the first decade of this century, and she can say much as to many of the changes that have taken place. And on the 16th of May 1885, it announces the death of Anne Morgan. Death of the oldest Australian native. The Bathurst Times learns that Mrs. Morgan Sr., known as Granny Morgan, died at her residence of her daughter-in-law, Mrs. W. Morgan, at Pitt Street, Redfern, on the 5th. This old lady was well known to residents of Kelso and Bathurst. She lived to be almost a centenarian, being 94 years of age at the time of her death, which occurred after she had been confined to her bed for 3 weeks. Mrs. Morgan's maiden name was Anne Collins, and her mother came to this colony a free woman in the Second Fleet that arrived in about 1791 as a servant, we believe, to the governor's wife. The deceased was born on the voyage out, not far from the Australian coast. Her father died when she was quite young, and she married when she was 16 years old. By this marriage, she had 15 children, 9 of whom are still living. The late Mr. W. Morgan of Kelso, who was born in Sydney, was the eldest, and he died in April 1881 when he was 73. The deceased had 60 grandchildren, a large number of great-grandchildren, probably more than 60, and at least 3 great-great-grandchildren. She came to Bathurst 33 years ago and lived ever afterwards with her eldest son's family. She enjoyed wonderfully good health until her last illness, and except a slight deafness, she possessed all of her faculties. Up to the last 2 or 3 months, she was as hardy as anyone could well be, able to walk up and down stairs to her meals 3 times a day. As might be expected, she had many interesting things to tell of the early history of the colony. She saw the first cattle arrive that ever landed in Australia, and there was then only a small jetty at the harbour and no houses to speak of beyond the government establishments. She often spoke of a journey which she frequently walked from Sydney to Parramatta, carrying her twin sons that were 3 or 4 months old. And when this was done, she used to have to grind corn in a small steel mill to make bread for her husband's supper. Those were the days of hard work and rough fare, and times have changed. Granny Morgan lived to see the settlement on the shores of Port Jackson grow into a magnificent city, the marvellous development of the interior, and the many interesting events in this and other colonies. She lived too to see her children in respectable positions. And speaking of George and Anne's children, the first that was earlier mentioned was William. He was born on the 20th of March 1808 in Redfern. He was a brickmaker like his father and worked at Cobberty and then Lambeda Farm at O'Connell Plains that was owned by Reverend Thomas Hassell. He also farmed at Kelso. He married Janet Williamson at Kelso, New South Wales on the 16th of July 1849 when he was 41. William ran a brickyard at Kelso in 1861, and William died in Redfern on the 21st of April 1881, aged 73 at his son's home. William's buried with his mother Anne, and he had 2 boys, William and George. In the will of William Morgan, he stated that he bestowed to his son William an allotment and premises at Stewart Street, Bathurst, and to his son George of the Crown Lands Department in Sydney, he left 24 acres in the Raglan village with a mortgage of £120. The property at Kelso where he resided, that consisted of 2 acres, purchased from John Dargan, was left to his wife Janet for her life and to go to his sons as equal tenants. The second child, Thomas, was born on the 25th of January 1812 in Parramatta. He was also a brickmaker. He married Mary Ann Ryan in Bathurst in 1854 when he was 42. He died in Kelso, aged 68, in 1880, and they had no children. The third child, Edward, was born on the 14th of August 1814 at Parramatta. He was a twin, and he was a saddler for the Hassell family at O'Connell's Plains, New South Wales. George, the twin to Edward, was 14 when he was a servant to George Brown of Illawarra. And there are 2 possible death records. One, George Morgan died on the 31st of May 1835 in Bathurst, aged 22, and there's also another possible George Morgan's death on the 14th of August 1822. The fifth child, Elizabeth, was born on the 26th of June 1815 at Minto, New South Wales. She married William Fish at St Paul's in Cobberty, officiated by Reverend Thomas Hassell, on the 11th of February 1831, when Elizabeth was only 15 and William 39. William was a ploughman and shearer when he was convicted at the Hertford Assizes for transportation for life. He came out on the Hebe in 1820. He was then transported to Port Macquarie in 1822 and returned to Sydney in 1825. He was a groom for Reverend Thomas Hassell in 1828 and received his ticket of leave in 1834 and his conditional pardon in 1841. Elizabeth and William had 10 children, and Elizabeth died in March 1891 in Leichhardt, New South Wales, aged 75. The sixth child, Sarah, was born on the 17th of December 1817 at Minto. She married Christopher Cantrell Myers at Cobbitty by Reverend Thomas Hassell on the 4th of July 1837, when Sarah was 19 and Christopher 29. Christopher was from an Irish Quaker family, and he was shunned for associating with unsuitable companions, which led him into acts of immorality, as was believed by his family, and he sailed for Van Diemen's Land by December 1833. They had 11 children together, and Sarah died in South Brisbane, Queensland, in November 1883, aged 65. The seventh child, John, was born at Minto, New South Wales on the 21st of October 1819. He married Catherine Finnemore in Sydney on the 25th of September 1841, when he was 21 and Catherine 15. John worked for James and Thomas Hassell at Cobbitty and Lambeda at O'Connell Plains from 1842 to 1898, and they had 14 children. John died at O'Connell Plains in December 1898, aged 79. An article outlining his death says, "I regret to announce the death of Mr. John Morgan Sr., an old and respected resident who died early on Saturday morning at the advanced age of 79. He came to O'Connell and settled at the Lambeden estate, then belonging to the late Reverend Thomas Hassell in the 50s, and remained there until his death. He led an exemplary life, always being ready to help those in distress, and was highly esteemed for his probity in all dealings. He leaves a wife and grown-up family." Mary Ann is the eighth child. She was born on the 26th of September 1821 at Minto. She married William Roberts on the 10th of January 1839 at Hassell's property Denby, near Cobbitty, and they had 12 children, and she died in July 1902 at Mittagong. The ninth child, James, was born on the 7th of September 1823 at Minto. In 1857 he was living at O'Connell Plains. He married Louisa Ann Lee in 1880. Louisa was 36 and James was 57 when they married. Louisa was from England and had been married before. James died at Bathurst in May 1895 at the age of 71. The 10th child, Joseph, was born on the 10th of November 1825 at Liverpool, New South Wales. He married Isabella Dunsmore at Bathurst on the 24th of June 1850 when he was 24 and Isabella 16. He was a blacksmith and worked at O'Connell Plains, and they lived at Bathurst, and they had 7 children. On the 30th of April 1859 in the Bathurst Free Press, there was a letter written to the editor. "Sir, in your paper there was an advertisement purporting to be from Joseph Morgan, blacksmith, cautioning the public from giving his wife, Isabella Morgan, my sister, credit. I take this method to inform the public that my sister does not require any credit on his account and is very doubtful that portion of the Bathurst public would give the said Joseph Morgan credit. Anne Hayes." That's sounding like things weren't going so well 11 years after their marriage. In 1861, Joseph was residing at O'Reilly's Mill, and he died near Bathurst in May 1895 at the age of 69. And his death was recorded in the Evening News in Sydney. Death of Joseph Morgan, aged 70, Lade of Lagoon, died at the home of his son, Joseph Morgan of the Lagoon. The church at O'Connell was overcrowded as the deceased was a very old resident and held in high esteem. The 11th child, Henry, was born on the 1st of January 1828 at Stoke Farm at Cobbitty. Henry was jailed at Parramatta when he was 16 in 1844, and he was in Darlinghurst Jail in 1850. The Maitland, Mercury and Hunter River Advertiser on the 31st of August 1850 outlines that in the Central Criminal Court that Henry Morgan was indicted for stealing a silver snuff box, 2 silk handkerchiefs and a promissory note for £23, 19 pence and 6 shillings from the residence of Reverend Thomas Hassell of Denby near Camden. The offence was clearly established. The prisoner, who had previously been in the service of Mr. Hassell, presented for payment the stolen money order with his master's forged endorsement, and he was found guilty. So that would have been an embarrassment to the family and certainly a bit of a blow to Thomas Hassell, who had certainly looked after his parents and employed them and his siblings at his properties. Henry Hassell married Elizabeth Palmer in 1852 in Victoria. They had 3 children, Henry in 1853, another Henry in 1854 and Elizabeth in 1856. There are family trees that record Henry dying in 1868 in Victoria, aged 40. However, I'm not convinced that this is the correct Henry, as this man was listed as a baker living in Brunswick. His wife on the inquest records state that she was Sarah Campbell, and it also stated in the inquest records that there were 5 children born. So he's either remarried and had further children, or I'm unable to find the exact death record for Henry. The 12th child, Charles, was born on the 6th of January 1830 at Denbigh near Cobbitty. He married Isabella MacPhail at Cobbitty in 1857, and they had 10 children. In 1900, he was admitted to the Parramatta Lunatic Asylum, and his record stated upon admission he has depression. He says he's sold his soul to the devil 47 years ago for 2 pence. He's sleepless, morose and unable to care for himself, and he threatened to commit suicide by drowning. He's also very despondent over religion matters. On the 10th of January 1901, his records said that he was in feeble health with no mental improvements. He's uncommunicative and he thinks that people are going to injure him. Charles died at the Parramatta Lunatic Asylum in August 1901, aged 71. There was a record of his death that states, on Monday last, a very old resident of this district, Mr. Charles Morgan, passed away at 70. He had been ailing for the past 12 months. He had resided in this district for years, and nearly all of his family, 6 sons and 4 daughters, were born here. The remains were interred at the Church of England Cemetery at Millthorpe on Wednesday, alongside his wife who predeceased him by 6 years. The late Mr. Morgan was a native of Denbigh, New South Wales, and he leaves a grown-up family to mourn their loss. Interestingly, one of his daughters was the informant on his death, and she did not know any details of his parents. So it's quite possible that Charles, with his mental health issues at an early age, may have lost contact with his family. The 13th child, Caroline, was born on the 21st of December 1831 at Denbigh, Cobbitty. She married Peter Carroll at Cobbitty in 1849 when she was 18 and Peter 22, and they had 11 children. Caroline died at Windsor, New South Wales in June 1907 at the age of 75. And there was a notice upon her death. Death has removed from our midst another fine old colonist in the person of Mrs. Caroline Carroll, wife of Peter Carroll of Windsor, who passed away on Thursday evening. The deceased was apparently in her accustomed good health on the morning of the day she died, going about her domestic duties quite cheerfully. Suddenly, just before noon, she swooned and never regained consciousness and died peacefully about the hour of 6 p.m. Through the breaking of a blood vessel on the brain, apoplexy was brought on, and this was the cause of death. The late Mrs. Carroll's maiden name was Morgan, and she was born at Cobbitty near Camden 76 years ago. She was married at St Paul's Church, Cobbitty, by the late Reverend Thomas Hassell in the year 1850. Mr. and Mrs. Carroll came to Windsor immediately after their marriage and never left the town. Here they enjoyed the respect of all classes of the community, and none are held in higher esteem. The late Mrs. Carroll was a good Christian woman, and her memory will be revered, not only by her own family, but by a large circle of people who knew her character and appreciated her many noble attributes. The family who are left to mourn for a good mother, as Mr. Carroll will mourn for and miss his devoted partner for life, and are all well known in the district. The 14th child, Susan, was born on the 6th of October 1833 at Denbigh near Cobbitty. She married John William Roach at Cobbitty in 1853 when she was 20 and John 42. John had been born in India, and he changed his name by deed poll from John de Rosa at some stage, probably before he arrived in Australia. He was an embalmer by trade, and it has been said that he had been a sergeant in the Indian Army. An article says that John Roach, a prisoner who arrived by the Aurora, was employed from January the 16th, 1834, in preserving birds and other curiosities at the rate of 1 shilling 9 pence a day in lieu of rations and clothing. So John William Roach was a London taxidermist, and at the age of 20 he'd been convicted of stealing, and as it was a first offence, he was sentenced to transportation for 7 years in Australia. He arrived in 1833 and 2 months later was assigned to the museum where he set about mounting the skins of birds. He was regarded as an expert craftsman and hence arranged for his employment to the museum. Despite his convict status, Roach travelled freely on his collecting trips and was assigned to accompany Surveyor General Mitchell on his expedition of exploration in 1835 and 1836. On his return, Roach was given a ticket of leave and formally employed by the museum as a collector and preserver of specimens for the sum of £60 per annum. Roach left the services of the museum in 1840 and set up a shop at 32 Hunter Street, Sydney. And an article in the paper in August 1843 states, City Museum, number 4 Hunter Street, J.W. Roach, taxidermist, collector and preserver of specimens of natural history. Begs leave to announce that he has fitted up a part of his spacious premises, number 4 Hunter Street, as a museum containing specimens in every branch of natural history, comparative anatomy and curiosities of all descriptions, to which additions will be consistently made and which he will throw open to the public inspection on Friday next, the 1st of September. The collection already contains, amongst others, some 100 specimens of birds and animals of Australia, set up and arranged in their most natural and pleasing forms. The want of such a repository has long been felt by the scientific and curious, and JWR trusts that his collection, to which he respectfully invites the attention of the public, will meet the approbation of all that those are engaged in the interesting and pleasing study of the most beautiful and perfect works of the Creator. Open to the public every Monday and Friday from 11 o'clock till 5 o'clock. Admission £1, children under 12 years of age 6, cards of admission to be had on the premises. JWR also has an aviary containing living specimens of some of the rarest and most beautiful birds, collections supplied to order, specimens set up and arranged in the best style on moderate terms. So Susan and John Roach had 2 sons, Henry born in 1855 and John in 1857. John Roach was a verger, that is an official in a church that acts as a caretaker and an attendant for St Paul's Cobbity from 1850 to 1890, and then his son Henry took over the task in 1890 to 1936. Henry then was succeeded by his son John Harrington Roach from 1936 to 1956, and then John H. Roach's wife, Charlotte Dorothy, took over from 1956 to 1966. So the Roach family gave unbroken service to St Paul's as vergers for 116 years. On the 6th of March 1858 at Camden, there's a notice that says, to the Chief Constable of Camden, Narellan, Picton, and to the Keeper of the Jail at Parramatta and all other peace officers, whereas Susan Roach has this day charged before John Oxley Esquire on oath of John Roach of Cobbity Labourer and others for that she is a dangerous lunatic, having attempted to destroy her child and to commit suicide. Therefore, to command the said Constable of Camden to take the said Susan Roach to the jail at Parramatta. 6 days later, we, the undersigned being legally qualified medical practitioners, do hereby certify we have examined Susan Roach at present confined in Her Majesty's Jail at Parramatta, and we find her to be insane and a fit and proper object for reception into the lunatic asylum. So this is the second child of the family that's been admitted due to mental health. I could not find a divorce record for Susan and John Roach. However, Susan married Thomas Wright in Forbes in 1862 and they had 8 children together, and she died in August 1910 at Goolgong, New South Wales, aged 76. The 15th and youngest child, Samuel, was born on the 21st of June 1837 in Denbigh near Cobbity. He married Jane Horner in 1863 in Bathurst. He was also a brickmaker in the family at Kelso, and then in the late 1890s he was a night porter and gatekeeper at Campbelltown Railway. They had 6 children and he died at Camden Cottage Hospital in April 1911, aged 73. So as you might have noticed, Granny Morgan, as mentioned in her death notice, certainly had many, many grandchildren, great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, as even though some of her children did not marry and have children of their own, she certainly had other children that had very large families.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.